Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants' lines will be on a listen-only mode until the question and answer session. At that time, please press star followed by the number 1. Unmute your line and record your name clearly as prompted. Today's call is being recorded, and if you have any objections, you may disconnect. And I'd like to introduce Erlene Dahl. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to Greg Hewitt from the Census Bureau for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our October LED webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome my colleagues, Heath Hayward and Christopher Getz, as they introduce Business Dynamics Statistics, or BDS Explorer. BDS Explorer is a new web-based analysis tool that enables comprehensive access to the entire BDS dataset via line charts, bar charts, and the thematic map. In this presentation, you will see how the application's intuitive dashboard allows for the construction of tables and charts to compare and rank measures of business strength such as employment, job creation and destruction, and firm birth and death across a wide range of establishment and firm characteristics. Heath Hayward is a geographer and applications developer in the Center for Economic Studies at the U.S. Census Bureau. He has developed data tools for the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics program since 2006. Prior to working at the Census Bureau, Mr. Hayward completed his master's degree in Geographic Information Science at the University of Denver and his bachelor's degrees in economics from DePaul University in Indiana. Christopher Getz is an economist also in the Center for Economic Studies at the Census Bureau. He has worked on developing and evaluating products using census business data since 2012. Prior to working at the Census Bureau, Mr. Getz worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He completed his PhD in economics at the University of Maryland and his bachelor's degree in economics for Northwestern University in Illinois. With that, I welcome Heath Hayward and Christopher Getz.
Thank you, Erlene. It's a very kind introduction. Chris and I are excited to be here today. So, as mentioned, we're going to talk about the Business Dynamics Statistics, or simply BDS, and a new data tool that we've developed called BDS Explorer. We appreciate you being here with us today. So before we begin, just a quick note that these are our opinions and they're not representative of the U.S. Census Bureau. So here's the plan for today. First, Chris will do some background on the BDS data, its inputs, the production processes, and the value that these data add to the landscape of the various federal statistics on businesses. He will then discuss some of the findings outlined in a soon-to-be-released CES paper on BDS that covers changes in the U.S. economy over the last 42 years. I'll then take over and talk about BDS Explorer, what's in the latest release, and then I'll do a live demonstration of the tool. And we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. But now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he will talk to us about the BDS data product. Chris?
Thanks, Heath, and hi, everyone. I'm just going to talk a bit about what the Business Dynamics Statistics are, where they come from, and the kinds of things you can use them to study. Essentially, the purpose of the BDS is to provide annual measures of how many business establishments and firms open, close, or continue their operations, and the associated job creation and destruction by those businesses. So as you know, the U.S. economy is very dynamic, with businesses entering and exiting, expanding and contracting, hiring and letting go workers all the time. So measuring this churn of businesses and jobs is important for understanding how the economy is changing and evolving, and how it's creating growth in terms of jobs and wages. And the data at the Census Bureau are well suited for tracking these firms and establishments over time. And we've done a lot of work to ensure that we can accurately measure these dynamics at a very granular level. And that means we're able to produce BDS tables at various aggregations of geography, industrial classification, as well as by firm and establishment characteristics like size and age. So on to the next slide. let's talk about what the specific measures are that the BDS publishes. First of all, it reports overall counts of firms and establishments. And note that an establishment is a particular physical place of work, like a store or a factory, and a firm is the larger business enterprise who owns and operates the establishments. So obviously this is one and the same if the firm has only one establishment. The BDS also measures how many firms and establishments enter and exit every year, expressed in the total number and also in rates. It tabulates the jobs associated with these businesses and how many jobs were created or destroyed. And since different businesses are growing and contracting at the same time, we can express job creation and destruction on either a gross or a net basis. And we can separate the creation resulting from business births and the destruction from business deaths. And all of these can be expressed as numbers or rates. These statistics are published nationally, of course, but we also have detailed information about the geographic location and industry classification. So the BDS are also published on these levels. Specifically, they're published by state, all 50 states and the District of Columbia, metro area versus non-metro area, and by all the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas individually, according to the 2013 definitions. They're also tabulated by industry down to the 3- or 4-digit NAICS classification, depending on the table. And note that the NAICS are defined on a consistent basis over time, where we translate all codes to the most recent 2017 NAICS vintage. That means comparisons within and across industries can be made consistently throughout the entire time series. Next, we publish statistics by various age and size categories, and this can be done from either the perspective of the firm or the establishment. The census data is fairly unique in its ability to identify whether a larger business enterprise owns each given establishment, and lots of work is done to track establishments over time across changes in ownership due to mergers and acquisitions and the like. So while the age of the establishment is simply the number of years that the particular physical location has existed, the age of the firm is the age of the oldest establishment that is under the larger umbrella of the enterprise. And it's easy to see why this distinction could be important. For instance, when thinking about new establishment births, we might expect that establishments born to a new startup firm will behave and grow differently than establishments that are opened by mature firms that have been around a long time. And similarly, the size of the business, which is simply defined by the number of employees in Q1 of a given year, can be categorized by either the number of workers at the establishment or at the national firm. And both size and age are stratified into about 10 or 12 detailed categories defined by various size and age ranges. But there are also coarser tables that aggregate these up into fewer bins, like small, medium, or large size, for example. And note that there are many cross-tabulations of different categories available. For instance, as depicted here in the slide, this is a table for firm age by firm size. So we can see the statistics for firms of a particular size and age combination. And now, due to confidentiality reasons, we can't cross-tabulate every category with every other category. So for example, there aren't as many cross-tabs at the finer levels of NAICS and geography. But there's still dozens of tables available showing 2-way, 3-way, and even up to 4-way cross-tabulation. And finally, note the long time series that the BDS are available for. The statistics go back to 1978, and as I mentioned, are published according to consistent definitions of geography and industry throughout. The most recent year is 2019, which was just released last month, and 2020 data will be released next year. So backing up from the BDS themselves, let's talk about the microdata used to create them. The backbone of the BDS and really of all business data at the Census Bureau is what we call the Business Register. And the BR and its predecessor, the SSL, go back to 1976, essentially covering all businesses with paid private sector employment in the U.S. So there are some exclusions, such as the self-employed or employees of private households. And while local government is not in here, or government at all in general, it does include certain government-owned or sponsored things such as hospitals. So the main purpose of the BR is to serve as an up-to-date sampling frame from which to draw for conducting various census business surveys, like the economic census, and in turn, information from these surveys, as well as tax data from IRS, feeds back into the BR and gives us annual information about employment, payroll, industry, geography, legal form of organization, and ownership. And note, most of this information, like employment, typically reflects the state of a business in Q1, or specifically March 12th of a given year. And that's how the BDS defines things as well. Now, since it's simply meant to be an up-to-date snapshot, there's no real longitudinal element of the BR, but that's where the Longitudinal Business Database, or LBD, comes in. So several years ago, researchers here in the Center for Economic Studies decided to create a longitudinally linked version of the business register. So using the various tax IDs and census codes, the LBD links each individual establishment in the BR across every year of its existence. In the cases where these IDs might change or fail to link, we use more sophisticated matching algorithms based on the names and addresses of the businesses in order to try to detect continuing establishments. And this is important for ensuring that we don't over-report entries and exits, and therefore job creation and destruction as well. The LBD also incorporates certain enhancements that the County Business Patterns Program makes to the BR data as well, especially in the form of improved employment numbers. So this cleaned and longitudinally linked LBD file is what the BDS are tabulated off of. So with the establishments and firms all linked across time, the business and employment totals and one-year changes can be calculated for each establishment or firm individually. And then we can aggregate them up to the desired level. And of course, we're mindful about the confidentiality of the businesses. So to protect the data, we apply a type of statistical noise, which keeps things, keeps aggregate averages intact, but guarantees that each given cell is not reporting an exact data point. And cells that contain an insufficient number of businesses are suppressed from the tables altogether. So finally, with all these statistics tabulated and protected, they are published as the BDS tables, and these can be found on the BDS website. They can be accessed in the form of the raw CSV files, or you can extract data using an API interface. And of course, you can view them with the BDS Explorer tool that Heath is going to show you soon. But before we look at the Explorer itself, let's first just look at a few examples of the kinds of things that the BDS can be used to study, and also get a little sense of how the U.S. economy has evolved in some ways over the past 40 years. To begin, this graph depicts employment data from the firm age by firm size table, the same one we saw on the slide above. And I've aggregated the categories in order to get to 4 types of firms: old and large, old and small, young and small, and young and large. And here, young is defined as being 5 years old or under, and small is defined as having fewer than 100 employees. And what's shown here is not the employment level, but actually the employment share, or the share of all national employment represented by each category. And this isn't a statistic that comes directly from the BDS tables, but it can be easily calculated with the employment numbers. And the first thing that pops out here is that the vast majority of employees work for older firms. If you add up the top 2 lines of old and small and old and large, you see it comes out to around 90% of national employment. So the idea that young startup firms are the key for job growth, it's not necessarily incorrect, but it shows that these firms don't actually employ very many people by the time they're 5 years old. In fact, you see the young small category, after rising sharply in the 1980s, has been on a constant decline ever since. Small businesses overall, on the other hand, do employ about 50% of the workforce, but it's the small and old firms that account for the bulk of this. And even their share of employment has been fairly stagnant over time. So we see it's really only the old and large category that has been actually rising for the last 30 years or so. Moving on to the next slide. This focuses on a geographic cut of the data, specifically from the MSA level table. To get a sense of how jobs have been moving to or from the big cities, I aggregated the employment statistics by whether they belong to one of the top 25 MSAs or one of the smaller MSAs. And here, top 25 is defined according to the population rank in the year 2000. This graph again depicts the employment share, and the dotted blue line shows the share of national employment located at establishments within the top 25 metro. And we can see that the share rose throughout most of the 1980s and declined in the late 80s and early 90s, but then has been rising fairly constantly ever since. In the most recent year of data, 2019, nearly half of all the jobs in the country were located in the top 25 metro areas. For reference, the dashed light purple line shows the corresponding population share located in these MSAs. And so the fact that the blue dotted line is above the purple dotted line shows us that the employment rates are higher in the top 25 metros. This graph also shows the employment share for certain industries. These are two-digit NAICS sectors here. And we see that there are considerable differences between industries. For example, the information sector is highly concentrated in large metro areas at well over 50%, and this share has only been rising over time. Conversely, manufacturing has been moving away from the large metros with a steep decline in the 80s and 90s and a continued gradual decline since. Some of the service sectors like retail, health, and food and accommodation experienced a dip in the 1980s, but have reversed course in the last 10 to 20 years and have started to move back towards the larger MSAs again. On the next slide, we will look at how we can use the detailed NAICS tables to get a more granular view of specific industries. So this figure charts the national employment share of all the three-digit subsectors within the information sector. So while we see the overall run-up in the late 90s and the subsequent decline from the dot-com boom and bust, we also see that the share of national employment in the information sector overall has continued to decline since then. The greatest declines are clearly seen in the bottom two categories, orange and blue, which are telecommunications and print publishing, which we might think of as kind of the old media part of the information sector. And we do see some increases in the more tech-based subsectors, such as the top three categories of the graph, which represent internet publishing, software publishing, and data processing. But note that even these don't amount to a very high share of national employment, together only reaching a share of about 2% by 2019. So this sort of contrasts with the notion that the economy is being driven by the internet and other tech-related fields, at least when it comes to employing workers. Next slide. But maybe focusing on the information sector is not the best way to zero in on the sort of tech-driven economy. For this, we turn to our four-digit NAICS table, which is the most detailed level of industry that we report. And in a recent research paper by a couple of Census Bureau economists, they explored different ways of defining the high-tech economy. And they came up with a method based on calculating which industries had the highest concentration of STEM workers. And the results of their study turned up the following list of four-digit industries. And they happen to span many different sectors, including information, like we talked about, but also mining, like oil and gas extraction, manufacturing, like pharmaceutical and aerospace production, and even professional services, like scientific research and engineering. So this chart shows the national employment shares for this collection of STEM-intensive industries. And we see that similar to the information sector, the high-tech economy had large employment fluctuations in the 80s and 90s, and the same decline in the early 2000s recession. But unlike information, the employment share stabilized quickly after the recession and has actually been rising since. However, we can see that much of this growth has been dependent on only one or two of these high-tech industries, most notably the computer systems category, which is the gray one on the top. And note that the overall share of employment in the high-tech industries is not particularly large at about 7% of the national workforce. So that's all I have to show you for now, but I hope this gave you an overview of what the BDS are and a sense of the types of things you can do with them. And now I'll hand it back to Heath, who will get into exactly what the Explorer tool is and how to use it.
Thanks, Chris. So now that we know a little bit more about the BDS, let's talk about the Explorer tool. As Erlene mentioned in the intro, it's a web-based analysis tool that enables access to these important statistics on business dynamics. The tool was first released on August 18th of this year. The tool was designed to enable access to all of the tabulations that are available in the raw CSVs, as well as what's available in the Census API's BDS endpoint. The tool was custom built using JavaScript. Specifically, we used the D3 JavaScript library to build the different visualizations, and the Vue.js library was used as the framework to manage the JavaScript. The tool offers 4 visualization types, each with flexible controls that allow users to build the exact analysis that you're interested in. All of the categorical variables, such as geography, industry, firm and establishment age, and firm establishment size, can be selected and analyzed. We can do categorical comparisons with the grouped bar charts, longitudinal comparisons with the line charts, and spatial comparisons with the thematic maps. Currently, we offer the exported data as a CSV download, and we plan to develop additional export options in a future release. As Chris mentioned, the BDS raw data production system adds a new year of data, usually in the fall, so BDS Explorer will be updated to accommodate these new data at that time. Late last month, we released the 1.01 version of BDS Explorer. Much of the work for this release was to prepare the tool for the updated API endpoint when the new BDS tables were released. The updated BDS tabulations include 2019 data, additional firm age and firm size crossings, and a full set of coarse and fine characteristics for these age and size characteristics. I'll show you a bit more how these coarse versus fine characteristics look in the tool, but as Chris mentioned, there's more crossings available if you choose the coarse characteristics. So for example, if you chose something more detailed, you will be a little bit more restricted, and interactions with substate geographies may not be available. In this latest release, we also improved the user interface in the tool, making the hover over interactions smoother and more informative, improving the table sorting, and adding more descriptive y-axis labels. Lastly, we improved the scaling of the visualizations for small screens and mobile viewing. Here's a quick view of the 4 different types of visualizations in BDS Explorer: the grouped bar chart, thematic map, the sortable table, and the line chart. So let's go ahead and jump right into the live demo of the tool. Give me one moment to open up my web browser. So BDS Explorer can be accessed at bds.explorer.ces.census.gov, or you can get to it from census.gov. So here is the census.gov website. So you can get to it a couple different ways. If you hover over Explorer Data, you can come down and click on Data Tools and Apps. And then these are all listed alphabetically. So if you scroll down, you can see Business Dynamics Statistics Explorer here. You can also get to it via the Surveys and Programs. So if you hover over this and then click All Surveys and Programs, again, this is alphabetical. You can scroll down a little bit, EB, and you can see the Business Dynamics Statistics website where you can get to the raw data, all of the methodology, documentation, as well as links to BDS Explorer. And you can also get to the Center for Economic Studies website, which has links to BDS Explorer, as well as a variety of other data products that come through this program. Let's head back to the tool. For this demo, I'm going to focus on highlighting the components of the user interface while showing interesting use cases of the BDS data, many of which will complement the analyses that Chris showed in his slides. Before diving into the data we see on the screen, let's talk about the user interface and all the various options that we see on the screen. Above the chart here, you can see the 4 visualization options. These are clickable at any time, but note that doing so may change your analysis settings in order to accommodate the new visualization type. Note that switching to the bar chart or the table will always preserve your settings. On the right side of the page here, under Settings, we can see all of the various drop-downs and filters that are available. The 3 drop-downs at the top are where the measure and the categorical variables can be selected. The x-axis drop-down here controls what characteristics form the basis for the analysis along the x-axis, while the group drop-down here allows users to group bars in the chart or add lines for comparison to the line chart. The filters below allow users to select a single characteristic by which to filter the analysis. The controls have precedence from top to bottom, so a change to the x-axis or group dropdown could change settings further down in the panel. This right-sided panel contains the brains of the tool. The majority of work of building BDS Explorer went into developing the metadata rules to ensure that interactions between the geography, the industry, and the age and size characteristics are smoothly handled. For example, we're currently looking at job creation, which we can see is defined as jobs created from expanding or opening establishments here on the y-axis label. And we're looking at that for 4 NAICS sectors broken out by firm age. If we look at the filter section, we can see these gray dots here. They indicate that a category is available to further refine the analysis. So we could select a filter from state, metropolitan, micropolitan areas, metro, non-metro, firm size, and initial firm size. The grayed out categories are not available for a cross tabulation. We can see this symbol with the up and down arrow means the category is in use elsewhere. So NAICS sector and firm age are selected above. And we can see the green check mark here indicates that the selection is active. A year must always be selected, either as a filter or in the x-axis or group dropdown. So let's go ahead and add a few more industries. You'll see we have 4 currently selected. So to do so, I can click on this 4 selections button here under the x-axis, and this will open up my selection panel. I'm going to go ahead and add transportation and warehousing, information, and healthcare and social assistance to my bar chart. I can close this panel by clicking the X here, or just simply clicking away from the panel. So keep in mind that we're looking at the overall economy in 2019 and essentially asking the question, is it young or old firms that are creating jobs? Let's look at the blue bars here, which represent firms that are less than 1 year old. We can see for accommodation and food services, young firms are creating a lot of jobs, the most in 2019 when compared to young firms in other sectors. But note that firms that are 11 or more years old also are creating a lot of jobs. Older healthcare firms, we can see in this light blue bar, are creating the most jobs overall in this chart. Interestingly, firms born before 1977, which are represented by this green bar here, are creating more jobs than the 11 and older age firms in manufacturing, in retail trade, and in transportation, but are significantly less in professional scientific services and in healthcare. Now that we've looked at a few industries by firm age, let's transition to looking at firm size characteristics to see whether it's big, medium, or small firms that are creating jobs. I'm going to change my group drop-down here from firm age down to firm size. You'll notice that all of the different geography and firm characteristics are available for selection in the x-axis or group drop-downs. Let's also show all 20 NAICS sectors instead of just the 7. So I'm going to click on 7 selections here. And I can just click Select Visible. You might notice that the bars are ordered a little strangely. They've been ordered from left to right based on the order that they were selected. So we can see here that the all NAICS sectors is showing up kind of in the middle of the chart, right after healthcare, which was the last industry that I'd added previously. So that functionality is there to give users the ability to create exactly the chart that they're interested in. So you can control the order of the bars if you want to tell a particular story. But for this analysis, I think we want the industries to be listed in the order that they're displayed in the selection panel. So what I'm going to do is just clear this and then select it one more time. And now we can see that the order matches what we see in the selection panel. As expected, all NAICS sectors blows up this chart because we're looking at count data. Let's open up the measure dropdown and we can see what other indicators are available for selection. So we can see the indicators are grouped into 4 different types. We have counts for employment, counts for firms or establishments, rates for employment, and then rates for firms and establishments. I'm going to select job creation rate right here. So this is constructed by dividing the count of job creation, which is what we were just looking at, by the average of employment in the current year and the previous year. So for 2019, the rate is constructed using the average employment of 2018 and 2019. So by changing to a rate, we can now compare a particular industry to the total without having size effects. So just a quick look at this. Check out utilities, both for medium-sized firms and large firms is quite low, as well as educational services for large firms. The flip side of this measure is the job destruction rate, which we can find right here next to job creation rate. This measure is defined as the rate of jobs lost from contracting or closing establishments. But the measure that I really want to use in this chart is the difference between these 2 rates. I want to see job creation rate minus job destruction rate so that we can get a net of all the jobs created and all the jobs destroyed. Let's come in and chain and select net job creation rate. In this chart, we can see that some industry firm size combinations have a negative net job creation rate. We can see, looking at the transportation, we can see that larger firms are the ones creating the most net jobs. We can also see that mining has a really high net job creation rate, but instead of for large firms, it's the medium-sized firms. Some other interesting things in this chart is that we can see with these blue bars, which represent the smaller sized firms, educational services, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation and food services. It's the smaller firms that have the higher net job creation rate. We can refine this analysis even further if we wanted to, as evidenced by the various options that are available to us here in the filters section. To show you how that works, I'll go ahead and click the All button next to Metro, Non-Metro, and we can see our options here are to look at all metro areas, all non-metro areas, firms that had to be, we don't know the exact location, but we can put them in a state, and then this sort of catch-all where we couldn't put them anywhere really. But I'm going to select all non-metro, non-micro areas. So let's see whether this dynamic has changed when looking at rural areas only. And we can see that the net rates seem to have dropped overall. Looking here at this red bar, we can see the admin, support, waste management, and remediation services, which is a sector I believe includes firms that employ temp workers. You've noticed that that has a sizable increase in net job creation rate in non-metro areas. So let's switch over to look at changes over time using the line chart. So to do that, I just can click this button here. And let's start out by looking at employment counts. I also want to remove my filter. So I'm going to click this X here to get rid of my non-metro area filter. And I'd like to look at the 7 NAICS that we looked at from the beginning as the lines in the chart instead of firm size. So I'm going to select NAICS sector here. You'll see I have 4 selections come on by default, but I can click this button and add in transportation, information, and healthcare to my map or to my chart. You will notice sometimes the application spins here in the quarter. So what that means is there must be a lot of traffic going to the Census API. None of the data is actually stored in a database or locally, so everything is going out and grabbing data live from the Census API. So the default in the line chart is to show the entire time series available in the BDS. So 1978 here on the left side of the chart, all the way to 2019 on the right side of the chart. First thing I notice from looking at this map is this blue line, which is manufacturing. We can see the slow decline of employment in manufacturing since 1978, falling to the bottom here at 2010 and actually increasing since then. We can see that the significant growth in employment in healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and even professional, scientific, and technical services has been increasing, which is likely related to long-term trends towards more knowledge jobs in the U.S. economy. Let's go ahead and add a firm size filter to see how that changes things. So I'm going to click the All button here. And now we can see an example of how the coarse versus fine characteristics come into play. So we can see the coarse characteristic for smaller size firms is 1 to 19, which is just an aggregation of the first 3 fine characteristics. I'm going to go ahead and select the largest category possible, which is 10,000 or more employees. And when I do that, we look and we can see the concentration of employment at so-called mega firms, especially in retail trade and healthcare. We can see manufacturing has dropped quite a bit in terms of the employment for these really large-sized firms. Let's get rid of this firm size filter, and instead let's take a look at older firms. So I'm going to click All, and in this time let's look at 11 and older. So I'm going to look at this coarse characteristic. And we can see something similar. We see really a lot of increasing employment in healthcare, accommodation, retail trade for these older firms, which aligns with a lot of the trends that Chris talked about in his earlier slides. Employment seems to be concentrating in older and larger firms. Now let's look at the net job creation rate for startup firms over the last 42 years. I'm going to change my measure back to net job creation rate. And let's change my filter from older firms to look at younger firms. So we usually think of these as startups. So immediately we can see the volatility of these rates for these industries over time. Healthcare and social assistance here is the purple line, and we can see how well it weathered the early 2000s recession, especially compared to all of the other industries here. And we can see a similar trend for the recession in 2008 and 2009, with the net job creation rate continuing to be a net positive. Another thing that jumps out is the information sector, with quite a boom in 2000 and followed by quite a drop in net job creation in 2002. But note that information sector seemed to do quite a bit better in the 2008-2009 recession, at least compared to several of the other industries. One thing that struck me on this chart is in 1978, healthcare and social assistance had the highest net job creation rate. Accommodation and food services had the lowest, and that trend followed all the way over in 2019. Healthcare and social assistance with the highest rate, and accommodation and food services with the lowest in 2019. So now let's take a look at the map visualization. I'll just click on Map. Now we can compare these business dynamics by geography. So immediately it will default to a state-level map. You can see that our net job creation rate measure continued over. You'll also notice that the filter continued, followed us over from the line chart. So we're still looking at startups. So immediately this map pops out. You can see for 2019, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Delaware have the highest job creation rates for these young firms. And on the other side, Montana, Connecticut, and Florida seem to have the lowest. It's worth noting that many companies incorporate in Delaware, as many of you may know, because of advantageous tax laws. The BDS team is working on getting the true physical locations for these new firms and getting them out of Delaware to the correct location. But for now, that's probably worth taking with a grain of salt. Let's go ahead and remove the firm age filter, and let's look at a different measure that we haven't touched on yet. So I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom, and let's look at establishment entry rate. So this shows the rate of establishments born during the last 12 months. And right now we're looking at state. So we can see the Mountain West states have the highest establishment entry rates. We can see it in California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. And then the opposite side of this would be establishment exit rate. So that's defined as the rate of establishments exiting during the last 12 months. And again, we see Mountain West states such as Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, and again, Florida are highest in the country in both entry and exit rates. It appears that these economies are right for businesses to enter, but also could be quite hard to sustain. So in addition to state-level geography, we can look at sub-state. So let's take a look at county-level data. So real quickly, let's get back to my favorite rate, net job creation. And I can select county from my geography dropdown. As you can see, when you select county from the geography dropdown, the tool will default to go to California counties and zoom directly to the selected geographies. You'll note that this map does look a little bit funny. Only one county is in the largest cohort, and it doesn't appear that there's any counties in the 17 to 28 or 28 to 39 cohorts. So this outlier, Alpine, California, with greater than 45 job creation rate, if I do a quick search online, which I've already done, it'll show that this is the smallest county by population in the state of California. So it's pretty easy to remove this outlier if you wanted to create a more interesting map. To do that, I would just click the 58 selections and just get rid of Alpine really quickly. Now we can see a much more even spread amongst the colored bins. And we can see in the hover over, we've got the rate shown above the name of the county. So we can show counties that across state lines as well. So to do that, you just click this drop down again and select a different state. So I'm going to come in, I can click on Arizona, and then I click select visible, and they'll pop up. Let's also add Nevada. So I can just select Nevada and then click those. So here we're seeing a region in the Southwest U.S. that has California, Arizona, and Nevada counties. And just a quick look shows there's a couple rural counties here in the middle of Nevada that have the highest net job creation rate in 2019. And as with the line chart in the bar, we can always see the data underlying the map by clicking the table button here at the top. So I click table, and immediately we're looking at the county names for our Southwest region here in the first column, and our data, which is the net job creation rate, in the second column. We can click on the column headers in order to sort. So click once, sorts ascending. Click again, sorts descending, and then one more time, we'll sort back to the default. And you can do that with the county names as well. It'll sort these alphabetically. And we can see that those two, Pershing and Eureka counties in Nevada, had the highest net job creation rate, whereas Churchill and Lincoln, Nevada, had the lowest. And just a quick note that we can continue to change our analysis. We can move filters around. So if I wanted to look at this in the table, I could change the year, or I could add a different filter. So we can see just changing the net job creation rate moved Churchill in 2019 had the lowest, but amongst all these counties, it had the highest. for 2018. So quite a bit of variability in that county. And as I mentioned earlier, CSV files are the only export currently available in BDS Explorer. The download data button can be found right here, this little down arrow. So if I click that, it'll save a CSV. Let's go ahead and open that up, and you can see this is the data that you get directly from the Census API. So we have the data column, the flag for the data column, which will let us know if something is suppressed or the reason that it's missing, our year, state, county, and all of the different categories if you have any filters or anything like that. And lastly, before I jump back to the slides, just a note about the links up here in the top right corner. If I click this documentation link, this will take us to a place where you can learn more about BDS methodology, some FAQs, and a code book for all the different variables. There's also a link here for home, and that'll take you to the BDS Explorer homepage, so a little bit more information about the tool. And there's a couple PDFs here that give a quick walkthrough and about the data. So that's all I have for the demo today. Let's finish up with just a couple slides, and then we can get to some questions. So what's next? BDS data product, as mentioned, is updated annually, usually in September or October. It's quite early in the process for planning next year's update, but the current goal is to release some experimental spin-off data products. First are the BDS for globally engaged firms. So this will provide BDS statistics for firms that import, firms that export, firms that do both, and firms that do neither. These firms are commonly called goods traders, and we create this designation by merging on import and export administrative record data. The trading designation will be crossed with other firm characteristics, like firm age and size, so that users can compare trading and non-trading firms on different dimensions. We also plan to release a Q2 specific BDS data product, which will be timed to provide details on business impacts from the COVID-19 recession. While the regular BDS calculates job creation and destruction for the year prior to March 12th, as Chris mentioned, the Q2 BDS would calculate job creation and destruction for the year prior to June 12th. And then, of course, we will be adding an extra year of data, so 2020 will be added to the main BDS data product. And I'm sure there will be other data improvements and production process enhancements that are developed over the next year. While developing this first version of BDS Explorer, there were several features that we wanted to add but didn't quite have the time. We plan the following updates for a 1.1 release. Shareable URLs so that you can save and share particular analyses. We want to add the ability to do some basic math on the fly, so allowing users to aggregate filter characteristics, and the tool will know whether to sum or to average those based on the metadata. So that will allow for normalizing, indexing on a particular quarter, or just creating shares of total. We also plan to allow different measures that share the same units to be compared in the same chart or table. And we'd also like to improve the suite of export options. And then lastly, we'd like to create a guided entry page as the new starting point into BDS Explorer. This would be similar to the guided entry that we created for the job-to-job flows Explorer data tool that some of you may know about. The guided entry aims to provide context for users to better understand the data before jumping into the tool. It's the concept of making data stories easy to find. Users will have a limited set of choices that will then drop them directly into an interesting analysis in BDS Explorer. The goal here is to make the tool as accessible as possible for both novice and advanced users. Here's a quick slide about our data dissemination plan. So as mentioned, BDS Explorer will allow you easy access with a flexible web interface. There's also a dynamic BDS tables available at data.census.gov. For advanced users, you can download a single CSV file from the Census FTP site. And then, as mentioned, you can query the BDS data via the Census API. Here's a couple useful links that we've talked about. Here are the two different analysis guide PDFs that we mentioned that can help you to understand the basics of using the tool and how to interpret the data. I'd like to point out links to technical documentation, as well as this link to the BDS working papers. These are really interesting papers where researchers explore some of the key features of the BDS data. So for more information on the BDS, please reach out to ces.bds@census.gov, or you can contact Chris or I at the following email addresses. So we now have some time for questions. Thank you all for listening.
Hi, Robin. We're ready for questions, please.
And thank you. At this time, from the phone line, you may press star followed by the number 1, unmute your line, and record your name clearly as prompted to be introduced. Again, with questions from the phone line, it is star followed by the number 1.
And while we wait for the questions to queue up on the phone, thank you, Heath and Chris. I'd like to remind everyone to please be courteous and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation with one follow-up question. We've received a few questions regarding the presentation and the PowerPoint, which will be accessible on the Census Academy website in a week or two at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. Also, an evaluation will be mailed to you following this webinar. We would appreciate it if you could take the time to fill this out to give us a better understanding of how we can serve you. And one last thing, my colleague Joyce Hahn will be reading your questions from the chat and closing out today's webinar. Robin, are there any calls at this time?
I'm showing no questions at this time, but just as another reminder, if you do have a question from the phone line, it is star followed by number 1.
Great. Thank you, Robin and Earlene. So I have quite a few questions from the chat. First off, does BDS break down by sector? Does it list firm name and zip code? Chris or Heath?
Yes, we publish lots of industry-level data at the NAICS sector, 2-digit, and then even narrower at 3 and 4 digits, depending on the table. As far as the names and addresses, those are on the confidential microdata, the LBD that I talked about. And those are available to researchers for approved projects at the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers located across the country. And to access the microdata that would have that kind of confidential information on it, you would have to submit a project proposal.
Okay, great, thanks. Next up is, how does BDS handle employment growth when an old large firm buys out a young growing firm?
So the firm age, the concept of firm age is based on the age of the larger firm. So in this case, that would be the acquiring firm. So yes, the young establishment that gets bought out by a big old firm would acquire the old firm's firm age. However, that's why we also have the concept of establishment age, and those are separate tables. And in this case, the young establishment would continue to keep its own age. So you would just see a difference depending on whether you tabulated it by firm age or by establishment age. And that's exactly the kind of thing that distinction is trying to capture.
Okay, great. And I believe you sent a link to the paper in the chat, but this question, just in case I wanted to read it, in case the person who asked had a follow-up question. On the high-tech sector chart, is this referenced somewhere outside of this presentation? Curious as to what the 4-digit NAICS codes were. I know you sent that paper out, but if the person had any follow-up questions, please send us your questions in the chat.
Yes, I've got the link. That's a published paper, and there was also a CES working paper, so you can access it.
Robin, are there any calls at this time?
I'm showing no questions from the phone line at this time.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll continue from the list of questions from the chat. Next, will the data be eventually broken down to the city level?
I'm not aware of any plans for city. Heath is a geographer and can maybe answer.
Yeah, I'm not aware either. I think my guess is that these cells just get too small, and I think the balance of accuracy and confidentiality protection would mean that at the city or place level would probably not be something that could be published. So I think metro, micro areas and counties are likely to be the smallest geographies that BDS will be published.
Great. This next question is about BDS Explorer. Why not put the data marks on the visualizations? It's much more informative and easy to do in Tableau with a right click. Will all of the census data be available in Tableau Public for download?
That's a good question. So we're happy to take feedback on the visualizations, and I think this is something we, when we put this out, this was what we call the minimum viable product, and the idea was that we wanted to get BDS Explorer out and have it in the eyes of lots of people, so we could both internally to the Census Bureau and externally for users. So we're definitely in a time of collecting feedback and suggestions. We want to make this tool as useful as possible. So definitely send your feedback to either to my email address or to the BDS email address. In terms of Tableau, I'm not sure what the policy is on whether census data will be available in Tableau Public. It's my understanding that the Census API really should be doing all of the heavy lifting of providing data in a way for visualizations to grab. I do think there's an additional layer that could be built to make data from the census, from an API, more accessible and really easy for Tableau users to develop. But I'm not an expert on Tableau, so that's a good question though.
Okay, next, is the information in BDS similar to LODE's WAC?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the firm age and size data in the LEHD data products, so that's the LODE data, firm age, the QWI data and the job-to-job flows data, they all come from the business register as well and from BDS. So they are similar. They are sourced from the same input data.
Next, what is the difference between job creation and job openings?
Job creation is the actual growth in the number of jobs at an establishment over a one-year period. I believe the questioner was referring to the job openings measure published by BLS, and that's based on a survey of employers asking how many jobs they have open, but it doesn't actually report whether they hired more people that year. So similar concepts, but different statistics.
Robin, are there any calls at this time?
There are no questions from the phone line at this time.
Great, thank you. Next question is, many of us work in economic development and have less use for national trends. What can we do with BDS to understand or use trends at sub-state levels, MSA, county, et cetera?
I think Heath went over the levels of geography that we can do this at, county probably being the smallest. And with the detailed industrial classification crossed by county, I think you can get into some pretty narrow stratifications of the data. But yeah, in my part of the presentation, I was definitely focusing on more national trends to tell a bigger picture. But yes, I think lots of local level analyses are possible with the BDS as well.
Yeah, I think all of the charts that Chris made are possible to create at any of those geography levels using the raw data And you can do a lot of it with BDS Explorer, but as I showed, because right now the tool only takes the exact data from the API, it doesn't do any math right now. So, you know, the charts where Chris showed the employment shares, that's not something you can do in BDS Explorer right now, but it's something we're going to be working on. But certainly with the raw data, you could go in and create any of those trend charts that Chris showed at substate geography levels.
Next question, is it possible to generate graphs with double scale, right and left, or alternatively, do we have to download the data in CSV format and build the graphs ourselves?
Yeah, at this point, that's not built into the tool. As I mentioned before, that's good feedback. That's something that I think maybe when we add in the ability to do indicator comparisons in the same chart, maybe that's something that we could examine. Certainly adds more complexity to the web chart, but I do agree that could be really useful. But at this point, if you wanted to create that, you'd have to download the data yourself, or build a web, some sort of web widget that uses the data directly from the Census API.
Okay, next, what does net job creation rate really mean? Is it a percent? And is it skewed if a county has a small population? So if there are 100 people and 25 jobs are created, could it look as if it had a relatively high net job creation rate, even though few jobs in terms of actual numbers were created?
Yes, exactly. Net job creation rate is basically the fraction of jobs that are new, that were newly formed in the past year. So yes, that example that the questioner wrote out is right. That would be a 25% job creation rate. But recall, we also publish the number of jobs created. So looking in the table, it would be easy to see that that 25% actually only corresponds to 25 jobs. So both are published as a number and a rate.
Great. And Heath, I think this is for you. When is the Q2 data likely to be available?
Yeah, I think that's probably referring to the BDS data product that's being developed to address details about the impacts of the COVID pandemic. Chris, do you know anything about the
Yeah, that would be,
date?
I think that's just going to be released along with the regular BDS release in September of 22.
Thank you. Can you show firm creation by 1,000 population?
Oh, as in divided by the population? No, we don't have any population statistics built in to the BDS. The user would have to merge that in by the same geography.
Okay, great, thanks. Robin, are there any calls at this time?
I'm showing no questions, but another reminder, it is *1 on your touch-tone phone to ask a question.
Okay, great, thank you. Next, is it possible to generate graphs with double, oh wait, sorry, that was a repeat of before, sorry. Next, are there any plans on including business owner ethnic breakdown?
As part of the BDS, no, because for most businesses, we don't have information on who the owner is. In the case of corporations and things like that, there aren't any owners visible to us because these are the business tax filings and business surveys and things like that that go into the database. I do know that in the case of sole proprietors, where they do file their business tax with their Social Security number, essentially, there are some efforts at the Census Bureau to attach owner demographics to those, and that's part of the non-employer statistics. So these are small businesses without employees, whereas the BDS is exclusively businesses who do have employees. So that would not be part of the BDS, but I would look at the non-employer statistics program.
Thank you. Next, is it possible to separate the job creation numbers by women and men? And similarly, are there any plans to include demographic characteristics?
As far as women and men, I assume they mean the workers, and no, this is not, there's no identifiable information about the workers. This is firm and establishment level data that just has an employment number, doesn't say anything about the employees themselves. For that, I would turn to the LEHD data, which is really made for studying the individual workers and their movements.
Yes, I'd recommend the quarterly workforce indicators data. Has a lot of the similar types of firm characteristics, but has the value of adding in worker characteristics as well.
Thank you. Next, can you explain the issue of statistical noise that is added to the series?
Yes, the idea is to fuzz the numbers slightly. We can't tell you exactly how slightly or not, but the idea is to do so in a way that preserves all the kind of averages. So on average, every cell you see is correct, but no cell is exactly correct. So no cell is revealing a particular business's exact information. And as I said, if there are simply too few businesses in a particular cell, those data cells are just removed from the table.
Okay, great. And last question from the chat. How about changing net job creation to net job change in the description of creation minus destruction?
That's an interesting idea. I see that it's kind of referring to the fact that you already have creation and you're taking away destruction, and that's kind of giving you the net change. And that's a reasonable suggestion. I think it's just comes from the terminology in the academic literature that kind of has arisen in the last 20 years. And when the BDS were formed, I think that was kind of the nomenclature at the time. So net job creation and net job destruction is what we use.
And one more question just came in. How does BDS account for NAICS code changes over time?
Yeah, that's part of the vintage consistent NAICS that we apply. It's a complicated algorithm because obviously the NAICS have changed many times, and they changed from a completely different classification, the SIC system, that predated NAICS. And so a lot of work has been done on this front at the Census Bureau to come up with a consistent industry identifier. And it's basically based on looking at the actual establishments that were there at the time that the codes changed and see how they changed their codes on tax filings, census surveys, and so on. So it kind of lets the data decide which code translates to the next vintage of codes, and that's rolled all the way back through the time series back to 1978, and so everything can be expressed on the same basis, which currently we use the 2017 NAICS.
Sorry, there's a follow-up to that. The person meant code changes at individual firms and establishment, not definition changes.
I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that question. I think we have an algorithm again for determining whether a code change at the establishment level is legitimate or not. Sometimes we see them change a lot. Sometimes they change once and continue. I can't tell you exactly what the algorithm does in those cases, but it does something to account for code changes at the establishment level.
Okay, great. Thank you. Robin, are there any calls at this time?
There are no questions on the phone line at this time.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Heath and Chris for introducing us to BDS Explorer. Join us next month, Wednesday, November 10th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, when Leah Brooke presents 3 graphs and 2 maps about jobs and teleworking during the coronavirus. As always, we appreciate your attendance, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.